Okay, this is the AP Euro Slideshow Spectacular on pop culture, consumerism, and religious beliefs during the 17 and 1800s. With your hosts, Curtis Kitchen and...
Andy Thomas.
So our main questions for this presentation is, how did the increasing literacy and farming practices affect people's lives? How did new forms of consumption change how people lived? What were the patterns of popular religion, and how did they interact with the worldview of the educated public and their enlightened ideas? So, to start this out with the pop culture and literacy, in the 1600s, 1 in 6 males in France were illiterate, and 1 in 4 males in England were literate. But by the 1800s, 2 out of 3 men in France were literate, and more than half of the men in England were literate.
And you have to understand that these are only males because the women were not getting as literate as the males. They did lag behind. They were getting more literate, but not as much as men.
During this time, Bible reading increased, and these chapbooks, which were cheaply printed pamphlets, which included Bible stories and prayers, were also a big thing that were coming around. Fairy tales and almanacs were also being published.
And chapbooks basically taught moral teachings and confidence in God, and they were widely used with peasants.
Okay. Now, peasants were not immune to enlightened ideas. Thomas Paine, with his Common Sense pamphlet in 1776, sold 120,000 copies, and it was translated into French and German. This showed that this made it possible for peasants to get enlightened ideas as well through these pamphlets.
He taught about the evils of government versus the natural society. And it showed, again, like Curtis said, the ability for the Enlightenment to really spread to those peasant populations.
So, the culture of the village was still shown as oral tradition. A lot of hobbies included drinking, beer, wine, and now hard liquor was easier to get. There were also urban fairs, which had prepared food, acrobats, magic acts, etc., and carnivals, which usually preceded Lent.
Basically, you started to get hard liquor back then because of the improved agriculture techniques. You had distilleries, and obviously potato and corn were coming over from America, able to make more products from that.
So the sports that were popular during the time, more commercial sports started to pop up, which meant they were able to make money from them. This included bullfighting, boxing, and horse races. And then there were things called blood sports, like bull baiting and cockfighting. Andy, what are those?
Those, basically, you get bull baiting is in like an inn or a hotel. You would have a bull chained outside, and he would be attacked by a vicious dog, and this would be entertaining for people. And I think we all know what cockfighting is. And interesting to note also is that the commercial sports there, bullfighting, boxing, and horse races, are all sports that nowadays we bet on a lot, so that was a big appeal back then too, betting.
Okay, so food at this time. Grain is like the go-to. There was a lot of peas and beans used, basically anything you could throw into a soup or a stew because it was just easy to make, like carrots, cabbage, and wild greens. Milk now starts being made into cheese and butter, and meats were not eaten as much because it was usually the richer people who were only able to hunt. Also, potato just had a ton of nutrients. It was just a fantastic food.
Yeah, like people in France almost ate 2 pounds of bread per day. It was a lot. It was a lot of bread, and that was definitely the main food. Potato had a lot of things that people could eat now. They had vitamin A, C, a lot of carbs and calories, which was really good. And another really big product back in this time was tea. Tea and sugar became really big, really cheap. A lot of people were drinking it this time.
So here's our checkpoint for our pop culture section. The main question was, how did increasing literacy and farming practices affect people's lives?
And the basic answer to this would be escapism. People were seeking escape from their everyday peasant lives with obviously the increased literacy, and they were reading. Farming practices, they were getting better food. They were having, these festivals with all kinds of fancy foods that only rich people could get before. And while it wasn't complete, like rich people still were eating meat when they weren't, it was definitely a lot more than what they had before.
So now into consumerism. The consumerism revolution was a growth in consumption and attitudes toward consumer goods. This was because of an increased demand for consumer goods. The reason for the increased demand was because there was an increased supply and there were more marketing campaigns. Also, the just price idea came about now.
Just price basically stated that prices should be fair. They should protect both the consumer and producer. So you shouldn't be charging things crazy amounts and putting people bankrupt, because then you're not going to get, obviously, their business more. So it's protecting both ends. And if it couldn't, happen by just regularly, it would be done by government incentive, which obviously Adam Smith would be against.
So clothes during this time period. Fashion became a big thing because textiles were cheap. So that meant that the lower class could look good like the nobles for less money. Also, during this time, ideas of privacy emerged. What was that, Andy?
Basically, in people's houses, they were starting to put up walls and create the ideas of wanting to be more private in their lives. They were decorating their houses more with more tableware and furnishings. And clothing was a big deal because now people could look like nobles for no money. I mean, it was always advertised you could look like a princess and all that.
And here we come to our first primary source. Louis Sebastien Mercier wrote A Day in the Life of Paris. So the first quote is, "Waiters from the lemonade shops are busy with trays of coffee and rolls, breakfast for those who lived in furnished homes." This talked about how the people who had the money were buying breakfast out on their ways to their work and their jobs. The second quote, "The Saint Honoré quarter, where the financiers live, is at its busiest now. Its streets are crowded with the customers and clients of the great," which just showed how people were going out and they were buying things. Like, that's the point of consumerism, is that people were buying a lot of things now, and it was helping make the economy, better. Okay, so our main question for this checkpoint of consumerism is, how did new forms of consumption change how people lived, Andy?
So there were the attitudes on privacy, which were big, but I think the big takeaway here is individualism. You could dress how you wanted, you could stand out to other people, and, businesses started coming up, you can buy more products, and all of that was really big at this time.
Okay, so the majority of all men and women were still Christian during this time. This remained strong because of tradition, and parish churches started to pop up, which were like a focal point for religious devotion.
Yeah, these were your typical middle-aged churches where obviously everything was revolving around it, all religious, and sometimes even government was revolving around just your one church with your priest and all that.
So now about the church hierarchy. Princes and monarchs took control of religious matters, which meant they kind of decided how the religion went. Spain takes control of its own churches and surprises everyone with the Spanish Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition! So yeah, basically, Spain starts taking control of their church affairs in Spain, and they take control of the Spanish Inquisition rather than letting the Pope do it. Also, you can see Jesuits are getting kicked out of France. There's obviously less appeal towards the Pope having power. And Spain and France actually pressure the Pope to dissolve the Jesuit order, which is interesting, and it does get dissolved.
Okay, now the Protestant revival happened as well during this time. So state power reduces Protestant goals of bringing people closer to God, which started to become an issue for some people. So Pietism begins in the late 1600s in Germany. It has three main aspects: warm emotional religion for all and an enthusiasm about religion, reaffirms the belief that everyone is their own priest, so you don't need a priest to give you the scripture, you can do it yourself, and the idea of rebirth. So John Wesley was a major figure in this. He formed the Methodist in England, which was, he looked at the Church of England as being used by the government to create high-paying jobs for the nobles, which they were doing. And he also rejected Calvinist predestination.
Yeah, he was interesting. He was an Anglican minister, basically, and then he saw, he wasn't satisfied with what was going on in England, so he had the Pious Revival and started all of that. He had, big sermons out in fields and was converting tons of people. And here we have a primary source from John Wesley's The Ground Rules of Methodism. Number 1 here, he says, orthodoxy or right opinions is at best but a very slender part of religion. So here we can see he's saying no traditions, it's all about faith, Protestantism. Second is the only way under heaven to this religion is repent and believe in the gospel. Again, we see that gospel, only believe in faith. And the last one here is where it really gets into Methodism. By this faith he that worketh not, but believeth in him that justifieth the ungodly, is justified freely by his grace, through the redemption which is in Jesus Christ. This is that revival. You can see where he's saying, even if you've strayed away, you can come back and you can still receive heaven.
So then there was another movement, which was Catholic piety. So the Baroque art and lavish churches were still a thing. And they had their festivals and their pilgrimages. And they had their own versions of pious revivals as well. Jansenism was a pious revival started by Cornelius Jansen, who accepted predestination and was heavy on original sin, and was actually not accepted by the Pope.
Yeah, he wanted that old St. Augustine Christianity, and yeah, he was not accepted by the Pope. He thought this was Calvinist, heretics, and he was, not accepted.
There was still a lot of superstition found in religion, especially Catholicism, and the Enlightenment inspired a purity of spirituality, which was against the superstition. So the common people who this was all they knew was this superstition of religion kind of lashed out against the educated elites who were challenging it.
There were some crazy things like believing that artifacts from saints would attract lovers, burying bulls at crossroads would avoid plagues of the hoof and mouth. There was some weird superstitions that obviously went against reason.
Okay, here's your final checkpoint for just religion. The main question, Andy, is what were the patterns of popular religion and how did they interact with the worldview of the educated public and their enlightened ideas?
So obviously those popular views are your superstitions and your modern day Protestantism and Catholicism. But obviously they change. There's this revival, the pietism, which allows people to go to heaven even if they've strayed away. And there's the reason from the Enlightenment gets rid of all this superstition that have been happening before.
Okay, so here's the review. Just the main points from every section. In our pop culture section, we talked about how literacy and new agricultural methods increase escapism and more ways to be entertained. In our consumerism section, we talked about how people are more individual and private and how they can dress fancier for less money. In our religion section, we talked about how superstitions were challenged, Protestant and Catholic ways of thinking were further reformed and revived. So
and that's it.
Yeah, that's all we have. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it helped. And
have fun studying.
Yep.
Woo!
AP Euro. Go!
Do it.